Well, hello everyone. I am delighted to be with you today. I am excited to see some familiar faces in the crowd, but also some folks that I have not met before. Those of you who haven't met me, I am Charlotte Selton. I'm APS's Member Advocacy and Mobilization Manager. I'm very excited to talk with you today about how you can advocate for policy change. So one thing to know on today's workshop is that it's going to be policy agnostic because I know that there's probably a variety of passions and political opinions in this room today, this virtual room, and I want you to be able to advocate on whatever you care most about. So we're going to talk in general about what successful advocacy looks like, what good tactics are, but we're not going to talk about any specific policies. I may use a few examples. Those will be science policy examples, since that is what we in APS Government Affairs work on. But before we get started, I am interested in knowing who's in the crowd. So would you mind either raising your Zoom hand or typing in the chat if you currently consider yourself to be an advocate? See at least one hand, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so at least a few people. Well, great. And hopefully by the end of this workshop, those of you who don't currently consider yourself an advocate feel like you have the tools to become one. So second question that I'm interested in knowing are what are some policy topics that you care about? So feel free to type them in the chat, and I will help read them out. But are there any policies that you wish were different? Maybe it's a crowd that just is enamored with the status quo and there's nothing that you'd want to change, but I think that's probably not true. Okay, I see LGBTQIA plus protection, regulatory capture. Well, feel free. Oh, I see some science research funding, climate change. Great. Well, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. But let's get into what science policy is, since as I said, that is what we at APS Government Affairs work on, and that is what I'm most familiar with. So we already have a couple examples in the chat that are definitely science policy topics. So when you think about science policy, there's really two types of policies that I want you to have in your mind. One is policy that impacts science. For example, research and development funding, like Susan put in the chat, visas for international students and scientists, policies that impact K through 12 STEM education. Those are all science policy topics because they impact science and scientists. Then there is policy that is impacted by science and should be informed by science. For example, I saw climate change in the chat. That definitely falls in this category. You could also think about energy policy, AI, national security. All of those would fall into the second category of policies that are impacted by science. At APS, we work on a variety of science policy topics, including research funding, visas and immigration, grad student and postdoc compensation, climate change, K through 12 education and workforce pipelines, and much more. If you're ever interested in working with us on any of those topics, feel free to shoot me an email. But what are the different pathways that we have when we want to impact an issue that we care about? So the first one is informing the public. And since I know that you all are already plugged into public engagement, this is probably something that you're confident and experienced in. But there are plenty of public policy topics that don't actually need legislation passed to impact. Sometimes you can go straight to the public and change outcomes that way. For example, let's say that you are very concerned about climate change and you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You certainly can focus on passing laws that will regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but you could also focus on mobilizing the public to demand that companies directly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, right? There's multiple ways to achieve that same end. Second option, if the policymakers that you have aren't supportive of the topic that you are passionate about, you could change that policymaker. If you're a US citizen, I hope that you vote. And I hope that you also all are working to help others vote. For example, by helping with voter registration issues and combating voter suppression. And then finally, you can convince the policymaker. And that is what advocacy is, and that's what I'll be focusing on today. How do we persuade policymakers to act on the issues that we care most about? So, advocacy is often your best tactic when you care about an issue that's probably not generally high profile enough for you to either mobilize a large segment of the public or convince enough voters to vote on that one issue. For example, something that APS has done a lot of advocacy on is helium, since helium is very important for a lot of low temperature physics research. Realistically, we're never going to get the American public to decide who they vote for based on helium, right? There are so many other issues that people have in their lives. They have to prioritize housing costs, education for their kids. Those are always going to beat out helium, but helium is still a very important topic, which is why we focus on going straight to the policymakers. To understand where you can influence the policymaking process, it's important to understand how laws get passed. So let's do a quick refresher in case you've forgotten some of your high school physics classes, or maybe you grew up outside the US and you never actually took US civics. So how does a bill become law? So the legislative process is how a bill turns into a law. And it really starts in Congress. So there's three branches of government, but we're going to focus most on the legislative branch. So a bill starts as an idea. An idea can be raised by a constituent, or it might be something that a member of Congress is already interested in. And then they're going to take that idea and they're going to write it into a draft piece of legislation. Then you need a senator or representative to introduce and sponsor that bill. As a member of the public, if you are not an elected official, you can't directly introduce a piece of legislation. From there, that bill gets assigned to committee for study. And this is the step where most bills die. They get assigned to committee and then they never make it out of committee. But maybe it gets time on the committee's calendar, they discuss it, they amend it, and then they vote to pass it. That moves us on to the next stage of the legislative process. So then the bill goes to the floor and it gets voted on by the entire House or the entire Senate. And if they pass it, it gets passed over to the other chamber. Both chambers need to pass a piece of legislation for it to become law. But often they'll pass two different versions because they can amend the bill however they wish. When that happens, both of those two versions of the bill get assigned to a committee who will need to conference it. So they will come up with a compromise version of the two bills. It goes back to both chambers, they vote to pass it. In that case, the resulting bill is going to get passed to the president. And the president has 10 days to sign the bill, passing it into law. The president can also veto legislation. And then there's occasionally a few special cases if the president neither signs or vetoes the bill, but those are fairly rare. So at any point in that process, a bill can die. It can die if the current session of Congress ends and it hasn't made it all the way to the president's desk and gotten a signature. For some context, in the last 25 years, only about 4 to 8% of all the bills that get introduced in a congressional session actually become law. So the vast majority of ideas are never making it into actuality. That also means that we have to be patient and persistent in our advocacy. This isn't something that happens in a couple months. It's often something that takes years and multiple tries to get passed. So where's our advocacy most useful in this process? So there's a couple points where you can have particular influence. One, you can tell your member of Congress or your senators about a problem or an idea for legislation that you have. If you've noticed something that is a problem, but nobody's taking action on, you can raise that to them. You can also ask your elected officials to sponsor or co-sponsor a bill that has already been introduced. And if that bill is either going to a committee for a vote or going to the floor for a vote, you can tell them how you want them to vote on that legislation. But to know who you are advocating to, it's important to know who represents you. So another little quiz. Let's find out how well you know who your elected officials are. And let's go ahead and start at the federal level. So can you go ahead and put in the chat anyone who you know represents you at the federal level? You don't necessarily need to put a name, but if you know the type of official. Yep, senator. Yep, representative, two senators and a representative. Great. Also, the president represents you. Realistically, it's much harder to get a meeting with the president than it is to get one with your members of Congress. But yeah, great job, Kristen, getting that the president is also federal. All right, you can probably guess what's coming next. How about at the state level? Who represents you at the state level? Governor, great. State senators. Any other examples? That is okay, Michael. You also have state representatives, and then you also have things like attorney generals. These are all elected positions that represent you at the state level and that can weigh in on state level policy. All right, final section. Who represents you at the local level? Any ideas? Sheriff, city council, mayor, great. They're coming fast and furious. School board, yes. Great. Okay, so y'all did pretty well on that quiz. But let's just, in case anybody doesn't know who represents them at the federal level, please go ahead and scan this QR code. It'll pull up a form. If you fill in your US address, it'll tell you who your federal delegation is. And this will be useful for the next couple slides, what we're talking about. Don't worry if you haven't managed to scan this QR code yet. It's going to remain in the top corner for the next few slides. But once you've got your senators and representatives in mind, how are you actually practically going to reach them? So through this QR code and on a variety of different sites, you don't have to use this one, you can find the contact information for your elected officials. I used a California address in pulling these screenshots because I live in the District of Columbia, which doesn't get senators, so I have a special case. But let's say that you live in Sacramento, California. This could be what your elected officials look like. And you'll see that they both have phone numbers and they have official websites. You're going to want to go to the official website link to have the most options for how to reach them. So one thing to keep in mind is that every single member of the House and the Senate is sort of like a small business in the sense that they get to decide how they want to run their office, what sort of staff they want to have, and how they want to set up their website, which means that there is no one consistent way to find the right way to reach your elected officials through their website. You may have to do a little bit of hunting. But somewhere on each of their website, there should be a section where you can email them. There should also be a section for how to request a meeting. Sometimes that'll be under contact. In the case of Alex Padilla, He puts that under services. But those are two critical links to have identified so that you're able to reach them both quickly, and email is a quick way to reach your elected officials, or for in-depth discussion. And that would be a meeting with your elected officials. You also should be able to find out where your elected officials' offices are. Most senators have 3 to 5 offices spread across their state, so you don't have to be able to come to Washington, D.C. to meet with the offices of your senators. Your representative also should have at least one district office, and if you're in a rural district that's larger, they'll often have 2 to 3 offices spread across. So you can request meetings at any of these locations. But now that you know that there's a variety of ways to contact your elected officials, you might be asking, well, if I only want to take one action, what would be the biggest bang for my buck? Luckily, we have some data to help guide us in that. The Congressional Management Foundation, if you haven't heard of them before, is a nonprofit that works to build trust and effectiveness in Congress. And one of the ways that they do that is by regularly surveying senior congressional staff. And for our purposes, the most relevant question that they have asked is this question from a couple years ago, where they asked congressional staff if their boss hasn't already arrived at a firm decision on a policy topic, how much influence would a variety of advocacy strategies have on their decision? So here are the results for that question. This is the percent of staff that said that each of these tactics would have a lot of influence. Right off the bat, notice that the number one tactic is an in-person issue visit from constituents. Constituent means someone like you, someone who is a volunteer, someone who lives in their district and state and is asked to meet with them just because they care deeply about an issue, not because they were paid to do it. Notice also that virtual and video calls are almost as effective as in-person meetings. Zoom has become ubiquitous since COVID, and congressional offices have definitely adapted. So even if you're not able to travel to an office for an in-person meeting, or maybe you have schedule demands that would make that impossible, a virtual or video call is almost as good. I also want you to look way down at the bottom. 2% of staff said that form messages have a lot of influence. Form messages, so when someone asks you to send a pre-written email to Congress, are one of the least impactful strategies, but we still see them used all the time. APS uses them as well because they're an easy entry point for new advocates. But I encourage you to take a few extra minutes and edit those letters so that it reflects your voice, your priorities, and your stories. Because notice how individualized messages to Congress have an order of magnitude more impact than those form letters. So going forward, I hope that you won't just click send on those form letters as written. If you care enough about the issue to send the form letter, hopefully you care enough to take 5 extra minutes to individualize that message. I also want you to notice the visit from a lobbyist. It's pretty low, right? 11% said that a visit from a lobbyist has a lot of influence. That may not seem to jive with your understanding of how Congress works. The main thing that I would point out there is that although an individual meeting with a lobbyist has less impact, realistically, lobbyists can take more meetings than you can take because it's their full-time job. On the other hand, when you're taking a meeting, you're having to carve time out of your day and of your life to meet on an issue. So that's part of why in-person issue visits from constituents have the most impact, because it demonstrates the most care. It's harder to do. So advocacy emails. Let's say that there's a breaking piece of news and you want to take action as quickly as possible. The easiest way to respond quickly is with an email. You can also call offices, but they're not open all the time. And these days, you're likely to get a voicemail. That doesn't mean that calling doesn't matter. You can absolutely leave a voicemail. The main way that offices use phone calls is just to tally how many calls they're getting for or against each issue. So there's no real point in going in depth in a phone call. Similarly, advocacy emails, these typically get read by whoever the lowest level staff in the office is. Um, so that might be an intern, that might be a legislative assistant, and they're often spending 30 seconds or less on each email. So you'll want to be succinct and get to your point as quickly as possible. You'll also want to quickly include the specific ask so that they understand immediately this is the topic you're discussing and this is what you want them to do about it. Although these emails typically first get screened by the lowest level staffer in the office and very quickly, they can also get passed up the chain. And you're more likely to get it passed up the chain if you include a personal story that shows why this issue impacts you. That also shows that you're not sending a form email, that there's a real person who wrote that email. One thing that you can consider at the end of your emails is asking the office to keep you updated on the policy topic. And depending on your comfort level, you can also offer to be a resource for offices on science topics if you're reaching out to them about something that is highly technical. But meetings, as we already know, are far more impactful than emails. So let's get into the meat of it. Let's talk about how you get a meeting with Congress. First things first, you need to be prepared. Remember that lawmakers have a lot of people asking for their attention, and that's especially true at the federal level. The average House district has 760,000 people in it. That's a lot of people potentially asking for meetings. And a senator could represent even more people. For example, senators from California each have 40 million constituents. That means that you need to be prepared if you are going to get on the office's calendar. Couple of things to have already researched and planned before you reach out asking for a meeting. First is to make sure you know what policy you want to discuss and what broader bucket of policy topics your meeting falls under. Congressional offices have policy staff who are each assigned to particular policy portfolios so that they can develop expertise in a handful of policy topics. If you're able to tell the office what policy portfolio your topic fits under, it'll be easier for them to assign you to a relevant staffer so that you can have as productive a conversation as possible. Some example of policy portfolios include education, climate, budget, natural resources, military. Second thing that you'll want to have already prepared is figured out when you are available to meet. And the more times you can offer the office, the better your chance of getting a meeting with a relevant staffer or your representative or senator themselves is. The ideal outreach window is 3 to 4 weeks before your meeting. So not too far out, but also if you're reaching out requesting a meeting for next week, you're probably not going to be able to get on their calendar. They're usually pretty full by that point. Next tip is to let them know right off the bat that you are a constituent. 95% of the time that an office has for meetings is reserved for constituent meetings. So that means that if you are trying to get a meeting with an office that it doesn't represent you. I know that often folks want to reach out to other senators or other representatives. Maybe you feel that your senators and representatives are a lost cause, or maybe you think that they're already so allied, there's no point in talking with them. But realistically, that's almost always a waste of your time because you're rarely going to get on the calendar for an office that you don't live in. If you do really want to try to get a meeting with an office that doesn't represent you, your best bet is to find a friend or family member who does live in that district or state, have them put the request in and have them join you in the meeting. You can take meetings as a team. Something to bear in mind is that when you are meeting with a congressional office to talk about policy and ask them to make a particular action, You are meeting with them in their official capacity. There's also the campaign side of politicians. For example, that when they're raising money for their campaigns, um, or when they are campaigning to get reelected, that's on their campaign side. But you don't want to blur the lines between those two different capacities. So that means that when you are reaching out to request a policy meeting, you shouldn't mention it if you voted for this official or if you gave them money. All that you need to tell them is that you live in their district or state and you care about an issue. Finally, be prepared to follow up. These offices are often getting hundreds of emails a day, and it's easy for yours to get buried. So if you haven't heard back in a week, don't feel bad about re-upping that message. Often that's the only way to actually get a meeting. You can also always try a different outreach method if you find that you're not getting a response through one particular mechanism. Let's say that email isn't working out. You can also call that office. You could message them on Facebook. Um, there are always other options. And also, APS members are always welcome to reach out to the APS Government Affairs team if you've been struggling to get in contact with your elected officials. And we can always try to nudge them here in DC. So once you've scheduled your meeting, what should you actually do in it? What does an effective meeting look like? So first things first, please start by introducing yourself and saying hello. I know that this seems obvious, but often scientists are so eager to get right into the meat of the discussion to talk about the policy that they're there to discuss, that they don't even tell the person they're meeting with who they are or why this person should listen to them on this topic. Your goal in this meeting is to influence the office, which means that they need to trust you. So don't undervalue the benefit of spending some time understanding who you're meeting with and what they care about. That'll help you be more effective in the rest of your meeting. Next thing you're going to want to do is make the ask. So, as scientists, we often want to first give background information, evidence, analysis, and build up to our main point. So, by the time we get there, everyone is going to agree with us. However, when you're advocating, you should actually invert that logic. So, start by letting the office know what you're there to discuss and what you want them to do about it, and then prove why they should do what you're asking them to do. Your best tactics for influencing an office are storytelling, which we're going to get more into in a bit. Um, Local statistics, if you have any information about how this issue impacts your district or your state, most of the time senators and representatives are getting lots of federal level information, but they want to know how this policy is going to impact the constituency that they represent. So if you can give them that information, they're going to care a lot more. And then also think about how to analyze the issue you're there to discuss from the frame of the issues that this office already cares about. So you're going to make the ask. Then, as I mentioned, your best tactic is a personal story. So I recommend that you always go straight from that ask into the personal story that shows why you care about this issue. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we are going to get to it in just a minute. So next, supporting evidence. As I mentioned, prioritize local connections. Realistically, these meetings are typically very conversational and very friendly, which might surprise you if you feel like you disagree with your elected official on everything. But the last thing that they want you to do is to go home and chat with your neighbor and say, I met with my representative's office and they were so rude to me because they don't know if your neighbor is a major donor or a key supporter. So they want you to always leave saying, it was a really nice and productive conversation, even if you disagreed on the meat of the issue. So you'll want to leave some time in your meeting for questions and for the conversation to go whatever direction the staff are interested in pursuing. Once you reach the end of your meeting, you're going to want to wrap up. I always recommend that you restate the ask, especially if your conversation is veered off track. You can also offer to be a resource to the office going forward. And you should also give them any physical leave behinds you brought with you. So it can be useful to bring resources that you can give to the person you meet with to share with their colleagues and to share with their boss. For example, if there was an op-ed recently published in your state that has the same view that you have, you might bring in a copy of that. If you have any stats that you shared, you might want to leave behind a copy of those stats. You might have a policy one pager that you're going over with the office, in which case, definitely leave that with them. We're not going to play act a meeting today. These meetings are typically a half hour long, and we only have 25 minutes left in this workshop. But I encourage you to practice before you actually take a meeting. Pull your friend, spouse, kids, whoever you can get to practice with you. You want to make sure that the first time you are saying your story and that you are offering your analysis isn't actually in that congressional office. So now let's talk about stories. I know that this is something that you've probably discussed in other contexts in the past. It's really important in public engagement as well. But let's talk about storytelling for advocacy in particular. So humans tell stories all the time. We all know that. We tell them to our friends, we tell them to our colleagues, small stories about our day, but we also tell big stories. That's often how we understand our lives and our history. Great stories are good in advocacy because they are sticky. Numbers are easily forgotten by most people. So, although as scientists, we often think that the best way to convince an office to agree with us is with some statistics that prove your point that just can't be refused, but a story is actually more memorable. It's also more accessible. Most of the time, if you are meeting with a congressional staffer or with your senators or representatives themselves, they are not going to be scientists and they won't have scientific expertise. So if you're talking with them about a technical subject, it's important that you make that case in an accessible way. Stories are also valuable because they build empathy. So when you're talking with an office that disagrees with you on a policy, a story can be a good way to touch them and help them understand your viewpoint. When I say storytelling, I do mean an actual story. There should be exposition, there should be a conflict, there should be resolution. An ideal story for advocacy demonstrates the problem that the policy you're talking about would solve, should definitely have a resolution that either shows what happens with the policy or what happens without the policy. And it's really important that you create characters and that you flesh out this story. I often hear scientists tell me, I have a great story to tell about science funding. And their story will be something like this. I run a lab, and in my lab, I have 13 undergrad students, grad students, and postdocs, and we get federal funding. But that is not a story. That's just a statement of facts. There is no pathos, there are no characters. So when you're telling a story, please try to be more personal. So now I want all of you to think about a policy you care about and a story that you might tell a policymaker. It should be personal. It also should be true. Please don't try to make up a story. It ideally is local. So I know that scientists often have moved around in their careers. If you have two equally good stories and one is from your current state, the other one is from somewhere you lived previously, the one that is in the constituency that you're advocating in is generally the better option. But if your only relevant story is from another state, that's okay. And then also think about how you're going to frame the issue. For example, let's say you want to advocate on climate change. If you are talking to a progressive Democratic office, just talk about climate change, right? That's totally fine. But let's say you're talking to an office that is a climate skeptic. In that case, you might want to frame clean energy instead as creating jobs in the state, You might want to talk about how it's decreased air pollution and how that has improved children's health outcomes. It's the same issue, but you're framing it in different ways. So now we're going to practice. So first, I'm going to give you all 2 minutes to brainstorm solo. So please pull out a phone, pull out a notepad, and jot down as many ideas as you can. Then I am going to turn to Meg and Allie to help me put everyone in breakout rooms of 2 to 3 people. And you'll have a few minutes to discuss and practice your stories in that breakout room. And then we'll come back, and if there are any brave souls who are willing to speak up, we will share those stories with the group.